The compound was eventually torn down, the land reclaimed, the ruins erased as though dismantling the walls could undo the history they once contained. But memory is harder to bury than wood and stone. Neighbors still point to the empty field and lower their voices, telling newcomers that something unspeakable once lived there, something that still lingers in the soil. Children dare each other to walk the property at night, and though the house is gone, they swear they hear footsteps in the grass or catch glimpses of pale faces watching from where windows once were. The girl herself slipped into anonymity, her life protected by silence. Some say she left the county entirely, rebuilt a new identity, grew into someone unrecognizable from the child who first stumbled barefoot into the light. Others whisper that she could never escape, that she remained tethered to the land, unable to sever the bond of blood and memory. The truth is uncertain, and perhaps that is fitting, for her story was never meant to have a clean ending. What remains undeniable is what she represents, a living warning of what happens when fear takes the shape of tradition, when secrecy becomes survival, when love is replaced by obligation, and blood becomes a prison. Her life is proof that history's darkest truths are not found in wars or politics, but in the forgotten corners of ordinary places, in houses where curtains stay drawn, in families who refuse to let the world in. To speak her story aloud is to confront something uncomfortable, that these horrors are not relics of distant lands or ancient times. They are here beneath our feet, woven into the soil of America. They exist where shame grows unchecked, where silence is chosen over truth, where neighbors look away instead of asking why. And so the girl rescued from the family compound becomes more than a survivor. She becomes a question. How much darkness can a bloodline hold before it consumes itself? And when we see that darkness, do we dare to confront it, or do we turn away, letting it grow in the shadows until another child is born into silence? This story is not just hers, it belongs to all of us, a reminder of the fragility of family, the weight of secrecy, and the cost of what we choose not to see. Time did not erase her past. Instead, it carved it deeper. As she grew older, doctors and counselors tried to help her rebuild what had been stolen: language, trust, the simple confidence to exist in a world larger than four rotting walls. But trauma has a way of clinging, not just to memory, but to bone. She carried it in the tremor of her hands, in the way her voice broke when she spoke too long, in the restless glance over her shoulder that never quite went away. The records of her life remain incomplete, as though the world itself was uncertain how to document someone born from a lineage deliberately erased from public sight. What is known is that the scars were not only physical. Teachers described her as fragile, prone to long silences, her gaze unfocused, drifting into places no one else could see. She seemed older than her peers, not because of wisdom, but because of weariness, a fatigue that belonged to the generations before her. And yet, there was something unshakably human about her presence, something that drew people closer even as it unsettled them. Survivors of violence often carry with them a duality, the horror of what they endured and the undeniable proof of their endurance. She was both, the shadow of a history many wanted to forget, and the fragile light that somehow emerged from it. What haunted those who worked with her was the question that could never be fully answered. How much of her was herself, and how much of her was the bloodline she had come from? Was she free to build a new life, or was she forever marked by the choices of her ancestors, trapped by a legacy she had no hand in writing? Each generation leaves behind more than names. They leave behind patterns, behaviors, curses whispered from one life to the next. For her, those curses were not whispered, they were screamed, etched into her body, her mind, her very DNA. And so her story became a mirror, one in which society was forced to see the cost of silence, the dangers of isolation, and the shadows cast when blood is twisted into chains. She was never meant to be seen, never meant to be found, yet here she was, a living contradiction, proof that secrets cannot stay buried forever, no matter how deep the soil or how dark the house that holds them. The community's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and denial. Some refused to accept that something so grotesque could exist so close to their own lives. Others whispered that they had always suspected something was wrong with the family up on the hill, but fear of being wrong, or perhaps fear of being right, had kept them silent. In a town where everyone knew each other's names, no one wanted to admit that a tragedy of this scale had been left to rot in their own backyard. As details emerged, the story spread beyond the county, picked up by newspapers hungry for scandal. Headlines spoke of inbred children, hidden compounds, and family marriages, too tangled for the public to make sense of. The girl became less a person than a symbol, her name withheld, her image blurred, as though protecting her anonymity could undo the years she had already endured. But behind every article, every whispered rumor, lay the same unbearable truth. This was not an accident. It was a design. The family had not fallen into this pattern by mistake. They had chosen it, and the girl's existence proved just how far they were willing to go to preserve their isolation. To the public, it was a story of horror. To the family, it had been survival. Two narratives clashing, one drenched in shame, the other in a belief that outsiders could never understand. For the girl herself, the outside world was not a rescue, it was another form of captivity. Authorities gave her shelter, food, clothes, but the walls of her past did not vanish. They lingered in her body, in the way she flinched when touched, in the way she slept with her eyes half open, in the way silence still clung to her like a second skin. She was alive, but she was not free. And here, the story shifts from the family's sins to the weight placed on her shoulders. Because she was not just a survivor, she was a reminder. Every time her story was told, every time someone whispered about her origins, she was forced to live it again. Her bloodline became her cage, long after the gates had been broken. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you bury the truth, or would you carry it into the light, knowing it would haunt you forever? When investigators finally spoke to her, they realized she had no true language. Words came out broken, fractured, stitched together from half-heard phrases whispered by her elders. She had never been taught to read, never held a book, never even seen one. Her world had been only faces that mirrored her own, voices repeating the same commands, and the endless stillness of rooms that never changed. Doctors would later say her silence was not just a lack of education, it was a defense. In a house where asking questions meant punishment, the safest thing a child could do was to retreat into herself. Her voice, like her freedom, had been locked away. And so when strangers spoke to her for the first time, she only stared, her eyes darting as though each word was a threat she had no way of understanding. She was malnourished, her bones delicate, her frame smaller than it should have been for her age. Scars traced her skin, not all of them explained. Some came from accidents in the collapsing house, others from hands that saw her as nothing more than a vessel for survival. For her, childhood was not a season, it was a burden, passed from one generation to the next. But it was her face, above all, that unsettled those who saw her. Reporters described it as uncanny, a mask that revealed both youth and age in the same expression. Her gaze seemed older than her body, as if she carried the exhaustion of every relative who had lived and died behind those gates. Yet when she smiled, rarely and faintly, it carried a haunting innocence, like a glimpse of the child she could have been had she been born anywhere else. What disturbed the authorities most was not just the crime of neglect, but the realization that this girl was not an anomaly. She was evidence of a pattern. Behind her stood generations of children like her, some who had survived, others who had not, all erased by secrecy. She was the one who slipped through the cracks, not because the family faltered, but because the outside world finally noticed. Her rescue was not just the end of her captivity, it was the unearthing of a buried truth, one that forced a community to face what had grown in its shadow. And in her silence, she became the voice of all who came before her, a living testament to what happens when fear, shame, and obsession take root in blood. The family had not always been hidden. Decades earlier, their land was known among neighbors for its sprawling orchards and hand-built barns, signs of a family that worked hard, lived simply, and kept to themselves. But when one generation ended and another began, the walls began to close. Outsiders were no longer welcomed. Marriages were no longer sought beyond the fence line. Slowly, the bloodline turned inward, curling into itself like a snake consuming its own tail. By the time the girl was born, the cycle was complete. Her relatives no longer remembered what it meant to belong to a community. They carried only the stories of suspicion that outsiders would take from them, mock them, or destroy what they had built. Fear became the family's religion and secrecy its scripture, and in that isolation, the only trusted blood was their own. Cousins were chosen as brides, uncles as fathers, and sisters bore children who were never meant to meet the eyes of strangers. What made this family different from whispers of inbreeding found in other corners of America was not just the closeness of their bonds, but the deliberate nature of it. Generations had conspired to keep the blood pure, believing they were protecting something sacred. Yet what they preserved was not strength but weakness, bones too fragile, minds too clouded, hearts too weary before their time. The girl's mother, herself a product of this unbroken circle, had the look of someone twice her age. Her skin had withered early, her teeth yellowed and weak, her posture hunched as though gravity pressed harder on her than on other women, and her father, though few would dare call him that aloud, carried the same hollow gaze, the same slack expression, as though identity had dissolved completely, leaving only a ghost of resemblance. When the girl cried in the night, there was no comfort. Instead, there was silence, a heavy silence that pressed down harder than any embrace. Comfort in that house was not given, need was not met. Instead, children learned early that their role was not to be nurtured, but to continue. They were threads woven into a tapestry of secrecy, their lives sacrificed to an inheritance of repetition. This was the inheritance the girl carried unknowingly, and though she would one day escape its walls, she could never outrun the truth written across her face, stitched into her very DNA, binding her to a past most would rather look away from. The compound itself stood like a monument to decay, tucked into the woods where maps forgot to trace their lines. The house had been built by the patriarch, her great-grandfather, or perhaps her grandfather twice over, depending on which record you believed. Weathered boards leaned inward, windows were sealed with rotting plywood, and the doors were locked not to keep people out, but to keep the family in. To the outside world, it looked abandoned, but inside, it pulsed with the echoes of a clan determined to vanish from history while ensuring their name survived through their own children. Investigators described the rooms as suffocating, beds shared by more than one generation, mattresses stained and thin, pushed against peeling walls, cans stacked high not out of preparation, but out of fear of ever needing the outside world. The air was thick with mildew, animal waste, and something else, something human, the odor of people living too close for too long, with no fresh air to wash away the years. In one corner, they found old family photographs, faded and warped, but when laid side by side, the images blurred together. Every face carried the same narrow set of eyes, the same high cheeks, the same strange tilt of the mouth. It was as if time itself had copied and pasted the same human template over and over, until identity was nothing more than a reflection of the last. The girl's earliest memories were not of toys or play, but of whispers in the dark, of voices arguing in tones she could not understand. She had learned silence the way most children learn speech. Speaking meant drawing attention, and attention was dangerous. Attention meant being chosen, and being chosen meant bearing the weight of keeping the family whole, though no one ever explained why or how. She wandered the compound like a shadow, pressing her hand against walls swollen with damp. As she would stare out of the cracks where sunlight tried to break in, watching dust shimmer like gold in the beams, she knew there was something beyond those boards, something bigger, brighter. But the rules of the compound were carved into her life. Do not speak to outsiders. Do not open the gates. Do not ask questions. To the men who found her, the most disturbing thing was not her appearance, but the quiet way she moved, as though she had learned to make herself invisible. Her life had been rehearsed in darkness, and now the world had no choice but to reckon with the horror she carried out of it. They found her barefoot in the dirt, her dress torn, her hair tangled with twigs and dust, her eyes so wide and unblinking that grown men froze when they looked at her. For years, she had never known the sound of a car, never felt the hum of electricity, never seen the world beyond the rusted gates of the family compound. To the neighbors, the place was a ruin, a forgotten plot of land tucked into the hills where silence seemed too heavy, too deliberate. But behind those doors lived a secret, one carried in her very bones. The girl who stepped out that day wasn't just a child rescued from captivity. She was the living evidence of a bloodline that had folded in on itself, generation after generation, until the boundaries between kinship and marriage had disappeared. Her face told the story before her voice ever could. A fragile jaw, too narrow for her teeth, a forehead high and sloped, as though time itself had pressed down on her skull. And her eyes, crossing slightly even when she tried to steady them, betrayed a genetic storm she never chose. People whispered about her the moment she was seen. Some said she looked older than her years, others that she carried an eerie resemblance to every member of her own family, as if they all shared one face, carved and recarved with each passing birth. Authorities would later uncover what she never understood, that she was born not out of love, but out of duty to a tradition unspoken, one that ran like a disease through the walls of that compound. A family so closed in on itself that escape wasn't just forbidden, it was impossible. Her father was also her cousin, her mother both her aunt and her sister by blood. The family tree was no tree at all, but a circle tightening over time, strangling out any trace of the outside world. And when the girl stepped into daylight, her body shivered not just from fear, but from the shock of an atmosphere she'd never breathed before. For her, the sky was too large, the wind too cold, the faces of strangers too sharp and varied. What she carried into the world that day was more than trauma. It was the weight of history repeating itself and the scars of secrets no one wanted to confront.